On my left, from Airbus Americas is Tim Ganner, Vice President of Strategy and Corporate Development. Tim spent 28 years and change in the U.S. Air Force, leaving the Air Force as a colonel. He is a KC-135 and KC-10 pilot. And when we talk about the KC-135 and KC-10, there we go, that was operator error. What we're talking about is the current strategic aerial refueling capability that the Air Force has, the 135 on the left and the KC-10 you see on the right. Tim also commanded KC-135 squadron and operations groups and is a veteran of Operations Desert Storm, Operation Northern Watch, Operation Southern Watch. His full bio with a lot of important details that I'm leaving out of necessity of time is in the online press kit. And to Tim's left and to my north is my friend Max Rothman, who's Director of Business Development for Light and Medium Military Aircraft for Airbus Defence and Space Inc. in our office in Herndon. Max was, by the way, for those of you who are joining us from the UK or are former UK residents, was base commander of RAF Fairford and RAF Welford. Spent 23 years in the U.S. Air Force, accumulating 3,500 flight hours, and was not just a C-5 and KC-135 pilot, but also an instructor and an evaluator. And Max likewise is a veteran of Operations Desert Shield, Desert Storm, Operation Allied Force, Operation Iraqi Freedom, and Operation Enduring Freedom, and probably one or two I left out. And finally, to his left is Larry Gologli. Larry joins us here today from Lockheed Martin Aeronautics. He is Director of Business Development for Air Mobility Programs and has a 30-plus year career in the U.S. Air Force and the Air National Guard. Larry has more than 6,000 hours in a C-130, which we don't list the C-130s as a strategic aerial refueling aircraft, but C-130s are used extensively in a more, I guess you would say, a tactical aerial refueling role by both the Air Force and the Marine Corps and the Navy. And Larry, likewise, he commanded the 143rd Airlift Wing, Strategic Airlift Wing, and is a veteran of Desert Shield, Desert Storm, Operation Iraqi Freedom, and Operation Enduring Freedom. So with that as the pedigree, let's get into what we're actually talking about when we talk aerial refueling. And to illustrate some of these different points, we're using examples from our friends at the Royal Australian Air Force who have done a great job of documenting their experiences with our aerial refueling platform, which is the A330-based MRTT. That stands for Multi-Role Tanker Transport. And we call it multi-role because, just as the name implies, it's capable of multiple different types of aerial refueling and simultaneously being used as a transport aircraft because it carries all of its fuel, both for its purposes and for aerial refueling, in its wings and fuselage tanks without impinging on the cabin that can be used for cargo or for passengers. So let's go ahead and watch a video from the MRTT that gives a pretty good overview of some different aerial refueling techniques.
From Baghdad, we met up with the F-18Ms of the US Navy carrier based in the Persian Gulf. From there, we met up with the Australian Wedgetail, where we passed 15,000 kilos worth of fuel to those guys today. And from there, we then met up with the US Marine Corps in the EA-6 Prowler. Rounding off the day today, we had the original 2 Hornets that came up the carrier. We finished off refueling them. The Link 16 is a great tool that we have available to us. Basically increases our situational awareness of other aircraft in the area, what's altitude, what direction they're heading, how much fuel they got on board, if they're cooperative. What I mean by that is if we've loaded them into our computer as a friend that we're going to be operating with, we like to know how much fuel we've got. So that's really important and it's really good for us as well. Yeah, one of the milestones happened just 2 days after Anzac Day. We passed the 50 million pounds of fuel since our first operations here in October 14. All this was out west of Iraq, and then from here we're now tracking back to our home base.
And the RAAF owns 6 of our aircraft out of a total 35 delivered, and we have 60 orders total for the A330 MRTT to date. Across 12 different nations. They call theirs the KC-30A, but it's the same platform. So, Larry, before we get into some of the mechanics of how we do the aerial refueling, I was hoping you could talk a little from a mission planning standpoint about why the aerial refueling is so important to the U.S. Air Force in particular as compared to some other allies. What kind of missions and what sort of a role is it fulfilling strategically?
Well, certainly, and thank you very much for having me. Happy to be here today. I think the simplest way to describe the tanker mission, the tankers are the great facilitator. We have all these very impressive fighter fleets around the world, whether they be U.S. fleets with F-16s and F-35s and F-22s and everything else, or F-18s or CF-18s at Bagotville here. They very rarely fight in their backyard. So they have to, one, get to where they're going, and you might see that type of operation as you see on the screen, where the tanker is what we call dragging the fighters to their ultimate location where they will then operate within the theater. And then once they get to the theater, then we set up the gas stations in the sky so they don't have to transit all the way back to the base to refuel and get back into the fight. So it really does allow the fighters to perform their missions wherever they may be, as well as allowing the bigger aircraft like the C-5 that Max flew operate efficiently all the way around the world by extending its legs and refueling those aircraft on the longer strategic legs as well.
And when we talk about the Air Force and this future requirement, this is really what we derived that from. So the Secretary of the Air Force put out a statement back in September saying that there was a need for an additional 14 tanker squadrons above and beyond any current program of record in the current operational fleet. Larry, can you sort of offer a perspective on, what is it that the Air Force is doing or intends to do that would require such a dramatic increase in aerial refueling capacity?
Well, when you look around the world and the global situation, we're often faced with what I call the tyranny of distance. And look at operating throughout Africa, let's say, or over in the Pacific theater, and how far those fighter aircraft actually have to go to be in areas where they would operate. We've developed war plans for executing operations in all those areas, but then you actually have to be able to execute those war plans. So when you do the math and how much gas those fighters are going to need and the areas they will going to have to operate over, that's where all that additional requirement comes from. And it is definitely a high demand environment.
And you were talking earlier about the role that aerial refueling plays in moving, for example, an entire unit, like an entire squadron on a deployment at sort of the early stages of that. What are the mechanics of that and the kinds of operations the Air Force is looking for there?
Well, as you brought up in your opening comments, when we look at the MRTT and the multi-role tanker transport, being able to operate as not just a tanker, but as a transport as well is very, very important, particularly on those initial deployments where a squadron is going to pack up everybody. They're going to take all their maintenance crews with them. They're going to take all their maintenance kit with them. And when you can put that on the tanker that is actually then dragging all the fighters over to that forward deployed location, you create a very, very efficient operation. So the tankers land, they have all the maintainers on board, all the equipment they need to set up an operation on board, and then the fighters just roll in naturally behind them. So it is a force multiplier for any operation.
Thank you. And when we were having those conversations back in December when the agreement was first announced, we were talking about different criteria that the U.S. Air Force had put out in an RFI that was released in June, looking for short-term commercial aerial refueling services, and they referenced in there boom refueling and hose and drogue refueling, and that also prompted some questions. So what I want to do is briefly take a look at the mechanics of boom refueling, and then I'm going to ask Max to expound on that a little, both as a refueling pilot and also a receiver pilot. Whoops.
KC-30 adds a valuable refuelling capability to the Air Task Group in this region, not only to our own forces but also to the coalition forces. The F-16 is the first fighter type to refuel with the boom in theatre, and we also refuel our own E-7 surveillance aircraft. The capability for the RAF KC-30 to refuel the F-16 adds another capability we can offer the coalition air forces to conduct a mission in Syria and Iraq.
One of the things you'll notice in these videos is sort of a recurring theme. These go back to about 2014 when A330, Airbus A330 multi-role tanker transports began refueling U.S. combat aircraft on combat missions, with those aircraft being operated by our allies such as the Royal Australian Air Force. I believe UAE and the UK were some of the early adopters as well that were refueling U.S. combat aircraft. In the U.S. inventory, the aircraft that have refueled and been certified to refuel on our tanker on the boom are the C-17, E-3 AWACS, the F-15, F-16, F-35A, F-22, and P-8. There are others that haven't been simply because the Air Force hasn't asked yet to have them to be certified. That's certainly a possibility. Max, talk a little bit about the boom refueling. What we saw there essentially was a controlled collision in the sky with a massive flying spear being stuck into the top of another airplane going how fast, conservatively speaking?
Yeah, well, before we talk about speed, don't ever use the C word, the collision. That's not a good word when we're talking about this. I will share with you that there's a warning in the KC-135 dash one. The dash one is the flight manual for the aircraft. At the very start of that book, it says, warning, flying to large aircraft in close vertical proximity is inherently dangerous. And that used to make me very nervous when I'd read that. And then it goes on to tell you exactly how to do that very thing in the manual, which was rather unique. But as you do that, the reason for the boom is to get lots of fuel passed quickly. The KC-135, very old technology, it came out in the late 1950s. And yes, we're still flying them today. They're about 395 or so still flying today, believe it or not. Those aircraft can pass about 6,800 pounds of fuel per minute. So it's still moving a lot of fuel through a tube for a larger aircraft in particular. Larry spoke a lot about moving the fighters, which is critically important. But don't forget, we're also moving bomber aircraft. We're moving heavier aircraft that are moving cargo for humanitarian aid, disaster relief, but also for other kinds of things. Anytime we're moving major movements of force, that force extension and what we call global reach in the United States Air Force, to reach across to other areas that are not the United States ultimately, to get those assets moved forward. That global reach with a tanker is critically important. As you might imagine, a lot of nations might not like to have a B-2 park in their neighborhood to refuel, en route to going and doing what a B-2 might be doing. So most B-2 sorties, for instance, take off from the United States, fly directly to their points of impact where they're going to drop their weaponry and fly home non-stop. Some of those round trips taking 48 hours or more, only enabled by air refueling. And they might do 6, 7, 8, 10 air refuelings en route. The boom that Jamie pointed out can pass lots of fuel, more even on the KC-10, from the KC-10, but 6,800 pounds per minute from even the older model KC-135. KC-46, again, a lot more fuel than that. So critically important to have the boom versus what you'll learn about the drogue as we talk about that here in just a minute. The boom is a flying mechanism, so you'll see wings on the end of that long sort of tube, the straw there, that the fuel comes through. It literally is flown by that boom operator. In the KC-135, very old technology, that boom operator lays prone, literally in what they call the bathtub in the back of the aircraft, laying in the tail of the airplane, looking through a small window back there. It's very old technology, but very effective. Lays there looking out a small window that extends from the back of the aircraft, just like that. You'll see that's a perfect picture. He's laying, quite literally looking out the tail of the aircraft for the aircraft to come up from behind in a rendezvous. As you might imagine with a fighter, that flying boom can literally, once connected, fly that fighter aircraft around the sky, and does quite frequently. The fighter connects to the boom and is then just using the tanker as its horizon. Bigger aircraft, I used to fly the tanker, but then I went and flew C-5 as a receiver. The C-5 Once I'm connected to the boom in the C5, I can push the tanker around quite easily. And it used to be very unique to do that now and then, just for fun. And then when I went back after flying the C5 to be a tanker pilot, once again, I had a much greater, healthier respect for being a good tanker pilot than I did beforehand. It's a great learning experience to do both things. Suffice it to say, the boom, as Jamie requested the discussion to be about the boom, is for larger offloads to bigger aircraft, multiple fighters, that kind of thing, all at once.
And given the size of the C5, you were telling me it actually has a bow wave that as the tanker pilot, you need to be aware of and compensate.
Yeah, absolutely. In many cases, as the tanker crew up front, we wouldn't even know if the fighters were connected yet. We would have to have the boom operator tell us that they were in fact in contact. When the C5 was coming up, or a KC-10 that was refueling coming up behind us, believe me, you knew it was there, and you knew it was pushing you. As you might imagine, a massive C5 aircraft, or even a KC-10 aircraft coming up behind, and directly underneath the tail, which is where the elevator is, that does all of your north-south movements in an aircraft. As that aircraft comes up, the bow wave, the air, basically a big air cushion coming off the nose of that aircraft, pushes underneath the tail and literally is moving the elevator up and down. There's quite a bit of compensation there. There were times when, in turbulence or just poor pilot technique, guilty at times, that you would literally scare the pants off yourself and come up too quickly beneath the tanker and would have to do emergency breakaway procedures and get out of the way quickly to avoid running into one another. Flying to aircraft in close vertical proximity is inherently dangerous once again. So it is a dangerous maneuver. There is a lot of aerodynamic factors at play when you're flying two airplanes very close to one another. You are literally feet apart and you're moving at 500 miles an hour in so doing. So it's doable, it's exciting, it's thrilling, it's rather dangerous, but it's doable and there's a lot of aerodynamic forces at play.
So let's go back and take a quick look at hose and drogue refueling. We saw in the opening video some of that boom, and then we saw U.S. combat receivers such as the FA-18 E&F Super Hornets. I think in the earlier video we saw maybe an EA-18G or an EA-6B. Let's go ahead and Annabelle watch this kind of focus in on the hose and drogue refueling, and then Tim will ask you to explain a little bit about it. Oops. Here we go.
The KC-30A has been contributing to coalition operations in the projection of air power and in efforts to defeat and degrade Daesh here in the area of operations. We refuel most coalition aircraft on just about every other day, and as part of that, our unique way of operating has given us a reputation of flexibility, reliability and innovation. The biggest challenges of working in this environment is the environment itself. So it's hot, it's sandy, we're operating basically 24 hours a day, 7 days a week on a very small footprint. So accordingly, the guys are out on the flight line having to think about ways to keep themselves cool and to still be able to maintain the aircraft. And in the air, we're often flying reverse circadian rhythms, etc. So managing fatigue is a key challenge. But thankfully, Australians are very resilient, and we're also quite clever in the way we go about things, and accordingly we're getting the job done. The most satisfying aspect of operating the KC-30A in theatre is the coalition environment, the fact we're working as part of a bigger team, but furthermore the fact that the aircraft has been able to have nearly 100% serviceability rate, and that's not just due to the operators, it's due to the whole support network of the Air Task Group. Being here with the KC-30A is tremendously fulfilling both personally and as a group. We're refueling most coalition aircraft and we're helping to defeat Daesh, and it's making a real difference on the ground, and that's something we're very proud of.
So, Tim, explain a little bit about the dynamics of the hose and drogue refueling, primarily from the standpoint of the enabling technology, the pods, and also the fuselage refueling option.
Sure. Whereas the lineage of the boom system goes back to strategic bombers as far back as the KB-29 in the late 40s, early 50s, to refuel large bomber aircraft primarily, large offloads, high offload rates. The lineage of the pod system really is carrier-based aviation, where aircraft would take off with self-contained pods that could be mounted on the wings and and then taken off after the flight. But to take off and put a nominal amount of fuel in the air for typically an evolution when fighters would recover, the carrier-based aircraft would recover. So the requirements for offload weren't great, and they certainly didn't need high offload rates. 2,500 pounds typically offload for an evolution. So that's the way that the Navy and the coalition forces developed their capability, and when we tried to have that capability for boom-equipped aircraft, the logical thing was to put that same pod-based system on the wing of a tanker and use the same technology, basically. In addition, when I flew the KC-10s, we had a centerline system that was mounted on the aircraft at all times. In other words, it didn't need to be added to the wing. It was inherent to the aircraft, and it was always there. So on a given mission, you could pull the pod out, or you could run the drogue out, and then bring it back in, and then use the boom later in the flight if you needed to. So you had the capability on the same flight to refuel either naval-type aircraft or Air Force-type aircraft. The difference on the two systems you might have seen in the video, whereas with the boom-equipped system, the receiver comes to the contact position and the boom operator plugs the receiver. With the drogue system, the pod is reeled out and it's stabilized at a fixed distance, and the receiver pod plugs it and gets the offload. So both systems are important. As you saw on the MRTT, they have a centerline system as well as wing pods as an option. So you can buy the centerline system, you can buy the pod system, you can get all three of them if you like. So it's kind of a capability that
Active versus passive.
right.
And one of the key sort of competitive discriminators that we've always positioned with our A330 tanker is the stability of that hose and drogue. So as the receiver is flying at that basket, essentially trying to put the probe in, the amount of movement that's inherent to that basket as it oscillates on the end of the hose. Can you talk a little bit about what controls the dynamics of that and what can cause movement of those baskets?
Sure, and that's specific to the wing-mounted system. Obviously, a wing-mounted system is affected by the wingtip vortices. So when you have a pod mounted to a wing, you're going to have some aerodynamic issues. All receiver aircraft have, all tanker aircraft that have carried wing pods have to deal with that interaction between the pod and the aerodynamics coming off the wing. The further out you put that pod, generally speaking, the more you're going to be influenced by the aerodynamics, the vortices. Interesting thing about the MRTT was the wing on the A330 is similar to it's very common with the wing on the A340. Recall the A340 was our 4-engine aircraft that preceded the A330. So when we decided to make our aircraft into a tanker, we noted that we could use the structure inherent on the A330 wing, which was designed for the A340, which also had the plumbing for that engine originally mounted there, which included electrics, hydraulics, pneumatics, etc., and put that pod on a very stable part of the wing, a relatively great distance from the tip, so it wasn't as influenced by the wingtip vortices. Plus, you had a winglet there that helped with the vortices issue, and you had a very stable pod system. In fact, it's quite an elegant design. So you have a structure, you have stability, you have the plumbing already set in the system, so that it's a very elegant design.
And in your careers, have you ever known of receiver aircraft to be struck by an oscillating basket? I know when I was at NavAir, we had that issue a couple of times.
Yeah, so depending on the stability of the pod, and when I flew KC-10s out in California, we actually had a couple of kills. We lost a couple of receiver aircraft where the basket either was moving too quickly, or more often, with inexperienced receiver pilots, they don't hit the basket just right. They hit it too hard. The take-up reel, that when the basket hits when the probe hits into the basket, a little bit of force, the take-up reel inside the system adjusts for it and comes in, and then eventually goes out. If it hits it too hard, it can't adapt it. What happens is you get a kind of an S sine wave, and then that comes back. And when it comes back, it whips, and sometimes it'll snap the probe right off. In my squadron at March Air Force Base, we had that happen with an A4 in the Pacific, and the fuel that came out when that happened went into a vent behind the pilot's cockpit. The vent went into the engine, boom. And next thing we knew, there was a parachute coming down. So you do have occasionally incidents with these, with the drogue systems. I will say they're rare, but occasionally you will see that happen. By the way, the same thing happens with a boom. Occasionally when you have, it is inherently dangerous. So you have a situation where the two aircraft become unstable, and you can have a nozzle break off into the receiver URC or some sort of accident situation. It's very rare, I will say this, it's very rare, but it does occasionally happen.
And, we've been talking from a pilot's perspective. I want to go back to the aerial refueling system operator's perspective. So this is a legacy system. We saw in the video earlier, they were looking on sort of a monitor system. This is actually, what we're about to see is a U.S. Air Force personnel who is serving on an exchange tour with the Royal Australian Air Force operating the system and showing both how it works for the hose and drogue and also for the boom.
Proper contact checklist to the line completed. We're currently on the KC-38 multi-role tanker transport aircraft, and we just refueled the E-7 Wedgetail for the first time on operations in the Middle East. We'll wait for the receiver to call stable ready and we'll clear to contact. As the Wedgetail approaches the KC-30, our first objective is to obtain visual contact with the receiver. Once we ascertain that, we'll make verbal contact with the receiver and coach them into the astern position, which is 50 feet after the air refueling boom, and then guide the receiver aircraft into the contact position through a set of lights underneath the KC-30A. At that point, we will maneuver the boom into the receptacle. Once it makes a solid and effective contact, it'll start the transfer of fuel to the receiver aircraft. Forward. The major significance of the Royal Australian Air Force KC-30A to be able to refuel the E-7 Wedgetail is increased flexibility in the area of operations. It allows us to refuel our own aircraft and provide that aviation fuel to increase the effectiveness of the RAF and ADF in the theater. Approaching halfway through the schedule upload. It's a great honor to fly with the Royal Australian Air Force for 3 years. It's also a great honor to be a part of this first-time event for the Royal Australian Air Force, in particular our squadron.
In the middle of that video, you may have seen an image that that looked like basically a very blurry display. The reason for that is that unlike the camera that was filming this, the operator is wearing special 3D glasses. This is actually on our enhanced vision system for the A330 MRTT, a 3D vision system. There are multiple cameras on the tail of the aircraft, and it produces that overlay so that the refueling operator has the same depth of field as the operator looking out a window at an actual aircraft instead of looking through a camera system. The other advantage of having a camera system, of course, is that it gives you both day and night capability. And these are images taken from our camera system of the same receiver aircraft in day operations and in night operations. And the final thing I'll ask about, and then we'll open it to Q&A, is we talked about, as we talked about night operations, all the video we saw was nice weather days, clear, sunny skies. You have to operate at night, you have to operate in bad weather, you have to operate sometimes in lightning, and you guys have shared some sort of hairy stories with me. Tim, have you ever been in an electrical storm trying to pass highly combustible fuel to an aircraft?
Yeah, my first couple of tours were in the southeast. I was in Seymour Johnson and Barksdale, both in KC-135s at Seymour Johnson as well as KC-10s, and then Barksdale in Louisiana in KC-10s. And during the summer, a lot of thunderstorms, a lot of electrical activity in the air. And so as a receiver pilot, you'd see the flickers coming off the boom, you'd see Say almost fire around the cockpit. Very frightening. I will say this though, for night operations, the good thing about flying at night, particularly after midnight or so, air's relatively stable at that point. Usually things have calmed down, cooled off. Air's pretty stable. So night refueling in stable weather is a little bit challenging but kind of fun. Anytime you're refueling in turbulence, it's no fun. And at night in turbulence, where you have restricted visibility and turbulence, that's the opposite of fun. I don't know what you'd call that. Really, really not fun. It's it's quite frightening. But of course, these missions call for it sometimes. When when you fly an operational mission, and we've all flown them, the weather's not perfect. You have to overcome it. You have to deal with electrical stuff going on outside the aircraft, and sometimes as it bounces inside the aircraft, that St. Elmo's fire, those things, you just kind of have to screw up your courage and go do it. So.
And Max, you've done that in a C-5, which is the largest aircraft in the DoD inventory. You were talking a little bit about the disorientation that can become a factor.
It's not uncommon at night as a receiver to be completely disoriented. As I mentioned earlier, when you're coming into the contact position, you don't use instruments inside your cockpit, and you basically have no reference to the ground. So you're flying now essentially off the horizon that is the tanker aircraft. So as you might imagine, if you're looking at the attitude direction indicator, the ADI, within the cockpit of your aircraft, you have a sort of a little aircraft image on that ADI. Now that little aircraft image that is your artificial horizon becomes the big airplane now out in front of your window. At night, all you see is the fuselage. The wings are ultimately, you might see a flashing light, but typically they turn those down or even off during the refueling process so as not to blind you or to give you false horizons. So it's completely disorienting in many cases. During the weather, it's even worse. You might have a lightning flash off to one side or another, and you don't know if that's the wingtip light or in fact lightning, and it is very disorienting. And so many times when in contact, you're looking at what you think is a relatively straight and level flying aircraft. He may be in a turn, and when they do the turns, the tanker is doing it very slowly and very carefully because he doesn't want you to fall off and wants you to get to gas. But it's, again, very disorienting. So you may be in a 30-degree left-hand bank. You may feel on the seat of the pants like you're in a 60-degree right-hand bank. It's extraordinarily uncomfortable, but you don't have a choice. You have to stay in contact. You've got to get your fuel. My most disorienting experience was with the president's helicopters and limousines and a communications package in the back of the C-5. Had a very full, very heavy airplane, 19.2 hours nonstop from Andrews Air Force Base in Maryland to Osaka, Japan. 2 KC-10s that met us over top of Alaska en route, and we had to refuel off of both airplanes. Took 90,000 pounds of fuel from one, left it, went over to the other one, took 90,000 pounds of fuel from the second one. By the time I got to the second KC-10, I had no idea whether I was right side up, upside down, not a clue. It didn't matter. I plugged in, got the gas, and when we finally left, I literally gave the airplane. The co-pilot went to the back and laid down for a little while because I was so completely lost as to whether I was, level, upside down, right side up. I had no idea. No horizon, completely clouded evening, no sun, no night, no light at all, no stars, nothing. Again, very disorienting, but it's part of flying the aircraft and part of flying 2 airplanes in close vertical proximity. So. And
the reason that, in particular, we wanted to share these stories is that, we're in the business of thinking and talking about commercial aviation, competitive discriminators in commercial aircraft, which are inherently based on things like efficiency, fuel efficiency, operational readiness. All of those are unquestionably, as Larry was pointing out, extremely important in military aviation. There's another element to it as well, though, which is that inherent danger in the mission that these aircraft are doing. And so as we think about, the difference between one type of aircraft and another in doing this mission, the systems that are really coming into play in truly life and death situations on a fairly routine basis. And so that considerably ups the stakes on how important a small competitive difference between one aircraft and another might be. So why don't we go ahead and open it up to questions now from the audience. And I think we have a couple of handheld mics we can pass around per usual. If I could ask for some assistance with some mic runners. Quentin, could I steal you to be a mic runner? Any questions? Yeah, Sylvia, back corner.
There it comes. On the job.
Test.
Thank you. Sylvia Five from the FT. I just had a couple of questions. You talked about 14 squadrons. I just wondered what does that mean in terms of sort of actual numbers for the initial requirement from the US government? And have you got any details of your partnership yet with Lockheed Martin? Thank you.
So as to the numbers, it's generally 14 aircraft per squadron. So, if they get all 14. I won't do the math in public, but it's 14
I can do that
aircraft.
one.
Thank you.
And in terms of the agreement, nothing's changed since when we put the announcement out on December 4th. You know, this is essentially at this point just an agreement to explore options. The customers indicated a potential market for capability, whether that's via a fee-for-service type model, as was sort of articulated in the RFI in June, or whether that's a more traditional, procurement model in the out years. All we're doing at this point is getting two companies together that have deep experience with aerial refueling capability and deep experience with servicing the needs of the U.S. Air Force and bringing them together to say, let's study the possibilities. Yeah, go ahead.
Just taking that a little bit further, I know the agreement also called for you to conceptualize a vehicle or a tanker, essentially. What does that? Does that mean actually come up with a derivative, potentially a derivative of the current MRTT that Airbus offers, or are you talking about, perhaps a next generation vehicle beyond that? This is something a nearer term rather than a far term option.
Well, I think the language of the release used was, conceptualizing the tanker of the future. And what that really means is that, while there's been speculation about follow-on programs to KCX, there isn't an existing requirement. So there's no sort of a KCY capability document. There's nothing that spells out what the Air Force might, in future years or future decades, imagine that they want their aerial refueler to be. So it's difficult to speculate on whether it could be an MRTT, which meets all of the requirements of the previous program and all the programs of the other countries that are operating it. It has about 80% market share, 85% I think market share outside of the U.S. But it's keeping our options open. I mean, it's again at this stage it's just saying let's position ourselves so that if and when in the future the Air Force articulates a specific requirement, we're ahead of the game and being ready to respond to that.
Just a quick follow-up on that. Lockheed's outlined a hybrid wing body tanker, which the Air Force was quite interested in as a concept. Could you envisage in the future that Lockheed and Airbus might be able to take that sort of concept forward as a further off part of this? Or is that really too far out there?
Well, again, in the absence of a specified requirement, any potential option is difficult to speculate on. Under the, if you look at the requirements that are stated in the RFI back in June, looking at commercial refueling options for short-term needs, those are what you might consider conventional options. Could a KCY or a KCZ be a less conventional design? Sure, it could be potentially. And again, that's where you get into the experience and the depth of knowledge of the companies. Lockheed, as you note, has all of that experience with low observability going back to the pioneering days at Skunk Works. We have the depth of experience on the aerial refueling side, and so it positions us well for being able to respond to whatever might come down the road. Any questions? Yes, sir.
Hello, Luis Carlos from Prime News. Going again with the new program, if Airbus will consult the contract, where will the aircraft be converted? In Spain or here in the States?
Sorry.
Yeah, and the second one is when you speak about a new generation of tanker, you're speaking about, for example, a 350 tanker, MRTT, or you are speaking about an aircraft like the Stingray from Boeing?
So I'll sort of take those in the two parts. As far as any discussion of where or if tankers might be built, it's far too premature to be able to speak about that. Again, we don't have a program of record from the Air Force at this point, hence we don't have a sense of scope. We have said, and said initially when the announcement was made that we envision that any sort of a requirement would require new build MRTTs, but there's no way to know at this point what kind of quantities we could be speaking about, and therefore what the business cases would be associated with manufacturing. In terms of type of aircraft, and again that goes to Guy's question, what we see in the RFI right now calls for a very conventional set of capabilities. In fact, I think it even specifies that it's comparable to what they have in inventory right now. It calls for determining the feasibility and capability of a commercial outlet to augment our current air refueling capability, and a fairly modest number of hours as well. So in the short term, those capabilities can be met with what we have in the A330 multi-role tanker transport. And again, when you start thinking about future concepts for the Air Force, that's really up for the Air Force to determine. If they set down a requirement, then at that point we would evaluate it and what the right solution would be. Mr. Hamilton.
Scott Hamilton with Liam News. Well, 14 squadrons times 14 aircraft is 196 aircraft. And you're talking about a commercial lease type of a deal. That seems like it'd be a heck of a lot of aircraft sitting around for not a lot of hours, perhaps. I have a hard time seeing where the business case to Airbus and Lockheed might be for that.
I'm curious, when you say looking at a commercial lease deal, where did you derive that from?
Well, it's a fee basis. This RFI is a fee basis type of thing. And so that struck me as an Omega Air type of commercial deal, or a lease deal like you do with the UK. Unless I misunderstand that.
Yeah, well, so you didn't on the RFI, but I think it's important to note, and the Air Force is best positioned to comment on this, but there were two separate and independent things that happened. One was the RFI in June that outlined some sort of, commercial outlet to augment current air refueling capability, and initially in excess of 7,000 hours annually. Separate from that was the Secretary of the Air Force statement in September of 2018 about the need for an additional 14 squadrons. Those two, again, it's for the Air Force to speak to, but we're not interpreting that as being the same thing. Could there be some overlap in that? Yes, certainly there could be. But I don't think, and again, not to speak for the Air Force, but I don't think it's accurate to interpret 14 additional squadrons as being fee for service for 14 additional squadrons or 196 aircraft. Does that clarify?
Yeah.
Other questions? All right.
Okay, well. Yeah. I know that you don't want to really talk about the competition. So I'm going to try to frame this in a way that you don't do that.
I wasn't aware we had any competition.
Yeah, well, your friends in Seattle have just delivered the first of its airplanes to the Air Force, but they continue to have problems with the visual way to connect the boom to the airplanes. Your videos here show that you've mastered that. As somebody who follows commercial, not military, I'm curious as to why you succeeded and the other guy still has problems. And again, I'm not trying to entice you into dissing somebody. I just don't understand.
Yeah, it's a difficult question to answer only because, we're neither in a position to have insight into anyone else's system or to comment on anyone else's system. I think, though, Tim, maybe you can just speak to sort of some of the flexibility that you're referencing in the system in the MRTT, independent of anyone else's offering.
I was on the tanker capture with EADS North America from 2005 to 2011. So for 6 years I was on that program. And during those 6 years we upgraded our visual system numerous times. We started out with the black and white system, and by the time we had our proposal submitted, we had a color 3D system that was high HD. We followed the technology that was rapidly progressing. It seems like every 6 months, new cameras, new capabilities. And we quickly inserted those into our proposal. That's one of the beauties, by the way, of this Raro concept, and it's software-based primarily, is that you can rapidly update it. So I think that's the reason why our system worked very well, was I think our engineering people were flexible enough to follow the technology and adaptive enough to take advantage of what was out there. And I saw remarkable progress over those. I mean, the black and white system, when I first joined the system, that watered my eyes. I thought that's the greatest thing since. But 2 years later, I thought, my God, what rapid growth and everything. And again, the color 3D system that we proposed to the Air Force was a magnificent system. And I think the one that's on the airplanes we're delivering now are actually better. So I can speak for Airbus and our system and say that our engineers are adaptive, they're following the technology, and I think it speaks highly to how they are approaching this particular issue.
Guy?
Yeah,
Just shout it out.
Yeah, you kind of won this round once, with KC-45. Essentially, what sort of lessons learned from that whole experience would you potentially bring to this as a real requirement? And sort of why would you win this time round, having actually your first win overturned? Is it sort of what will make a difference this time?
I would characterize it this way. We made two promises during the tanker campaign, the KCX campaign, both of which were contingent upon our winning the contract. The first promise we made was that we were going to build large aircraft at a new manufacturing facility on U.S. soil, specifically in Mobile, Alabama. We lost KCX. We are, this week, breaking ground on our second large aircraft manufacturing facility on U.S. soil in Mobile, Alabama. The second promise we made was that we would be able to aerial refuel U.S. combat aircraft sooner than a competitor. We lost the contract, and we've been refueling U.S. combat aircraft with our aircraft in the hands of our allies since 2014. I would add to that too, when you talk about our competitive prospects, the largest program in terms of number of platforms that we have with the U.S. Department of Defense is the UH-72A Lakota helicopter that you'll see tomorrow in Columbus, Mississippi. They've delivered 423 and counting of those aircraft over a period of about, I want to say, 12 years and change now. Those of you who followed DoD will arch an eyebrow when I say that every one of those aircraft, every one of them has been delivered on time and on budget. When I was at the Naval Air Systems Command working in acquisition, that was simply unheard of, unprecedented in the 60-plus ACAT-1 large acquisition programs that we were managing. When you have that kind of a record of program performance and meeting commitments, I think for any defense customer that positions us quite favorably. And so, that combined with the capabilities inherent in our platform and combined with the depth of knowledge and experience of a company that's been taking care of the U.S. Air Force since going back to, the venerable P-38 Lightning, I think positions us quite well to be able to meet any requirement the Air Force might articulate.